Miss Crockett, you will not speak over me." The words cracked like a whip through the courtroom. Judge Judy's voice slicing the air with the confidence of someone who had silenced 1,000 others before. The gavel struck once, then again, as though to pound authority into the floorboards themselves. Gasps rippled across the benches. Some leaned forward in shock. Others exchanged knowing glances, but all understood. Something unusual was brewing. Judge Judy sat back in her chair, chin lifted, eyes narrowed. She wasn't just trying to keep order. She was daring Jasmine Crockett to submit. It was the kind of moment Judy had built her brand on, a flash of intimidation, the sharp edge of dominance. Her empire thrived on control, on making people smaller with the swing of a gavel and the bite of her words. To her, this was routine. To the crowd, it was spectacle. But Jasmine wasn't just another guest in Judge Judy's world. She wasn't a trembling defendant or a nervous plaintiff. She was a woman who had weathered storms far harsher than a judge's bark. Dismissive tones, attempts to silence her voice. These were not new battles. And if Judge Judy thought she could simply wave away Jasmine Crockett, she was gravely mistaken. The tension in the room was thick, almost cinematic. You could hear the rustle of jackets as spectators shifted, waiting for the counterpunch. A faint whisper spread across the benches. Would Jasmine shrink back, or would she rise? Cameras clicked, catching the flicker of fire in Jasmine's eyes. The narrator's voice cut in, heavy with anticipation. But what happened next left the courtroom stunned. Because this clash wasn't just about order in the room. It was about who gets to speak, who gets heard, and who refuses to be silenced. The gavel rested, the silence swelled, and every pair of eyes locked onto Jasmine. She had only seconds to respond, but those seconds felt like an eternity. In that pause, in that fragile space between intimidation and reply, history seemed to hang suspended in the air. And then, Jasmine leaned forward, her lips parted, her gaze steady, her presence unshaken. The room braced for words that would ignite the kind of moment no one forgets. What she was about to say would not only shock Judge Judy, it would ripple far beyond the four walls of that courtroom. The silence that followed Judge Judy's outburst was not ordinary silence. It was the kind that swelled with electricity, the kind that made every heartbeat feel louder than the gavel itself. The courtroom was a stage, and everyone knew they were standing on the edge of a moment that could either collapse into humiliation or explode into defiance. But why did this confrontation matter so much? Why did it feel different from the countless other cases Judge Judy had presided over? The answer lay in the clash of legacies. On one side was Judy, the face of courtroom television, a woman who had built a career on sharp quips, fast judgments, and absolute control. To millions, she was the embodiment of authority, someone who had earned her crown by never losing her grip on the room. On the other side sat Jasmine Crockett, a rising voice in American politics, a woman who represented communities long pushed to the margins. She was more than just another lawyer or legislator. She was the daughter of perseverance, the product of grit, and the living symbol of a new generation that refused to be silenced. This wasn't simply a disagreement about decorum. It was a collision of eras, a tug-of-war between an older order built on intimidation and a newer one demanding dignity. Judge Judy's bark carried the weight of decades, but Jasmine's silence, poised, unbroken, carried the weight of centuries of people told to sit down and stay quiet. The audience knew it. You could see in their eyes as they leaned forward, drawn by the gravity of the moment. They weren't just watching a courtroom spat. They were watching the embodiment of a larger question. Who decides who gets to speak in America? Who holds the power to define which voices matter? The stakes stretched far beyond that wooden bench and those glaring lights. For Judy, this was about maintaining her throne, proving she could still silence anyone who dared to challenge her authority. For Jasmine, this was about more than her own dignity. It was about the dignity of every person who had ever been dismissed because of their skin, their gender, or their refusal to shrink. The narrator's voice cut like a drumbeat. If Jasmine Crockett faltered here, if she let Judy's gavel drown her out, it would reinforce the oldest script in the book, that power belongs to those loud enough to take it, not those brave enough to earn it. And yet, Jasmine didn't falter. She sat taller, eyes steady, refusing to surrender to the silence being forced upon her. Her presence alone raised the temperature in the room. Every breath she took reminded the audience that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The crowd could feel it. Something monumental was about to happen. Judge Judy had delivered her challenge. Jasmine Crockett was preparing her answer. The outcome wouldn't just decide who won this courtroom. It would reverberate through headlines, hashtags, and households across the nation. And just when it seemed Judy had the final word, Jasmine's resolve set the stage for a reply so sharp, so unshakable, it would send shockwaves far beyond the cameras. Because what happened next wasn't just a response. It was a revelation. To understand why this clash was so explosive, you have to understand the figure sitting at the bench. Judge Judy wasn't just a television personality. She was a cultural force, a woman whose name had become synonymous with sharp authority, biting dismissals, and the iron grip of control. For decades, she had wielded the gavel like a weapon, not only to settle disputes, but to showcase dominance. In her world, no one talked back, no one interrupted, and no one, absolutely no one, dared to challenge her authority without paying the price. Her reputation had been built on a formula: cut through the noise, strip away excuses, and silence the opposition with a withering glare or a barbed remark. It made for good television. It made for viral clips. But it also carried a darker undertone. Behind the applause and laughter, behind the tell-it-like-his persona, there was an unquestioned arrogance, a belief that the loudest voice deserved the final word. And that arrogance was on full display when she turned her gavel against Jasmine Crockett. It wasn't just an interruption. It was an assertion. I decide when you speak. I decide when you are heard. I decide how this story will unfold. To Judy, Jasmine was just another figure to silence, another moment to reinforce her brand of dominance. But arrogance has a way of underestimating its opponent. And Judy underestimated Jasmine. The irony was thick. Judy's career had been built on calling out arrogance in others, on cutting down defendants and plaintiffs who thought they could outsmart her. Yet here she was, embodying the very trait she had so long mocked. Her dismissal of Jasmine wasn't about law, order, or fairness. It was about ego, about maintaining the illusion that her authority was unshakable. The crowd sensed it. Every sharp word, every glare that Judy delivered carried less of the wisdom of a judge and more of the impatience of someone desperate to maintain control. And in that desperation, she revealed her vulnerability. Because when you have to shout to silence someone, when you have to strike the gavel twice to assert dominance, it shows not strength, but fear. Fear that the balance of power is shifting. Fear that the old ways of control are losing their grip. Fear that someone like Jasmine Crockett could stand firm, unshaken, and expose the cracks in Judy's carefully crafted image. The narrator's voice swelled. Judge Judy had built her empire on silencing others. But what happens when she faces someone who cannot be silenced? What happens when arrogance collides with dignity? In that moment, Judy represented more than herself. She became the symbol of an outdated system, a system that believes authority is earned by intimidation, that power comes from volume, and that silence can be forced upon those who dare to resist. And just as every empire built on arrogance has its downfall, Judy's attempt to silence Jasmine was setting the stage for her own unraveling. The cameras captured it all: the cold stare, the cutting tone, the unwavering belief that her word was law. But as the world would soon see, the louder Judge Judy tried to assert herself, the more powerful Jasmine's eventual reply would become. Because in trying to silence her opponent, Judy was writing the very script of her own undoing. And Jasmine Crockett was preparing to read that script out loud for the world to hear. Before Jasmine Crockett ever sat under the glare of courtroom lights, before her name echoed through headlines and hashtags, she had already lived a story of defiance and resilience. Her journey was not paved with privilege or easy victories. It was carved out of long nights, uphill battles, and a relentless refusal to let anyone else write her destiny. She was born into a world that did not hand her a microphone, but handed her silence. She grew up watching people in her community dismissed, underestimated, and too often ignored. The weight of that injustice settled into her bones early, shaping her into someone who could not look away when others suffered. Every book she opened, every hour she spent studying, every case she prepared was driven by that same fire, the need to speak for those who had been told they had no voice. When Jasmine first stepped into the legal world, she wasn't greeted with open arms. Courtrooms, law firms, and political spaces were not designed for someone like her. They were designed to reward conformity, obedience, and deference to those already in power. But Jasmine refused to play small. She refused to tuck her words neatly into the margins where no one could see them. She carried herself with a boldness that unsettled some and inspired many. Her career was marked by a simple but radical philosophy. Dignity is non-negotiable. Whether she was defending a client, addressing a legislative body, or standing a protest, she carried the same unshakable truth. No one gets to strip you of your voice. That truth became her armor, and it became the very reason people either revered her or feared her. Jasmine's story was not just about her own rise. It was about the echoes of those who came before her, the ancestors who had marched, spoken out, and paid the price for daring to challenge authority. Every time she walked into a courtroom, she carried them with her. She was the daughter of history's courage and the sister to a future not yet born. That legacy gave her strength, but also placed on her shoulders an unspoken responsibility, never to back down when silence was demanded of her. Which is why her clash with Judge Judy struck such a deep chord. This was not Jasmine's first time being told to quiet down. It wasn't the first time someone tried to cut her off, to tell her that her words were too much, too sharp, too inconvenient. But every time, Jasmine had answered the same way, by standing taller, by speaking clearer, by reminding the world that her voice was not a privilege granted by others. It was a right. The narrator's voice pressed into the story. She had been underestimated before. She had been talked over before. But Jasmine Crockett had learned early, when they try to silence you, that's when your words matter the most. Jasmine's rise to politics only amplified that truth. In the halls of Congress, on the campaign trail, and in the media spotlight, she became a lightning rod, admired by some, attacked by others. But every confrontation, every dismissal, every attempt to sideline her only strengthened her resolve. She didn't just want to win arguments. She wanted to change the script entirely. And so, when Judge Judy snapped at her, it wasn't merely another interruption. It was history repeating itself. It was another powerful figure trying to remind her of her place. But Jasmine's entire life had been preparation for that exact moment. She had been trained by struggle, refined by resistance, and steadied by a lifetime of standing against the storm. For the audience watching, many saw themselves reflected in her. They saw their own battles to be heard in family dinners, in classrooms, in boardrooms where their voices had been sidelined. They saw a mirror of their own frustrations with being dismissed. And in Jasmine's composure, in the way she refused to flinch, they also saw hope. The clash between Judy and Jasmine wasn't just about two women in a courtroom. It was about generations colliding. One clinging to authority by force, the other embodying authority through authenticity. And as Jasmine prepared her response, the weight of her journey stood behind every word she would choose to deliver. Her silence in that moment was not submission. It was strategy. She knew that words delivered at the right time could topple even the loudest gavel. And as Judge Judy sat convinced that she had won the exchange, Jasmine was quietly summoning the courage of her past, the fire of her people, and the clarity of her mission. Because her story was not about avoiding confrontation, it was about redefining it. And the courtroom was about to witness what happens when history meets arrogance, when dignity refuses to bow, and when a woman forged in struggle finally unleashes the truth she was born to speak. What came next would not simply be Jasmine's reply. It would be her declaration. The moment stretched, taut like a wire about to snap. Judge Judy leaned forward, eyes blazing, gavel poised like a threat, ready to cut off Jasmine before her words could land. "Ms. Crockett," she snapped, voice sharp as steel, "this is not your time to lecture." The courtroom shivered at the audacity, sensing that the clash had escalated from a mere interruption to a full-blown power struggle. Jasmine Crockett remained perfectly still, her gaze steady, her breathing even. She knew the stakes. This wasn't just a courtroom spat. It was a test of who could command authority without being intimidated. Every eye in the room followed her, waiting for a tremor, a sign of hesitation. But she gave none. Her calm was deliberate, almost surgical, a contrast to Judy's fraying composure. The tension became palpable. Judy's interruptions grew sharper, her words sharper-edged, slicing the air with increasing force. "I will not tolerate insolence," she barked. Each declaration was meant to break Jasmine, to force a reaction that would validate Judy's dominance. But Jasmine's silence was her shield, her patience a weapon in its own right. Whispers rippled across the courtroom. Social media feeds were already imagining the scene, clips circulating. Hashtag Crockett versus Judy, hashtag courtroom showdown. The audience, both in the room and online, was invested. This was no longer a local confrontation. It was a cultural moment. People were holding their breath, sensing that what happened here could resonate far beyond the benches. Judy tried another tactic, leaning back and smirking, a flash of condescension in her eyes. "You think you can speak over me because of politics? Because of your platform?" The words were sharp, dismissive, but Jasmine's face betrayed no reaction. She was listening, calculating, waiting for the precise moment to turn the tide. The courtroom atmosphere thickened, the clash intensifying with each passing second. Every gavel strike, every sharp command was met by Jasmine's poised resistance. It was a chess match played with words, posture, and presence. Observers could sense the momentum beginning to shift. Judy's confidence, so unshakable at the start, now showed cracks. Her interruptions became hurried, her tone edged with impatience. She had underestimated Jasmine, and the imbalance was tangible. Narrator's voice punctuated the escalating tension. The louder she tried to assert control, the more the room realized this was no ordinary courtroom clash. One voice demanded silence, but the other refused to be diminished. The energy in the room surged as Jasmine's posture remained unyielding, her eyes locked onto Judy's, conveying both respect and resolve. The audience leaned forward collectively, every heartbeat synchronized with the unspoken question: who would break first? Who would claim the narrative? As the verbal sparring reached a fever pitch, the murmurs of the audience turned to an anticipatory hush. Cameras focused on the smallest flicker of emotion, the tiniest shift in expression. Every interruption from Judy now carried the weight of imminent failure. And Jasmine, holding steady, signaled that the moment of reckoning was near. Because this escalation was only the prelude. The storm had gathered, tension stretched to its breaking point, and every person present knew whatever happened next would not just shock the courtroom. It would set the stage for a response that no one could ignore. The courtroom held its collective breath. Every eye was fixed on Jasmine Crockett. Every camera, every spectator, every whispering observer sensed that the moment of reckoning had arrived. Judge Judy's gavel hovered, poised to strike again, but this time, Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't shift uncomfortably in her chair. She leaned slightly forward, and with deliberate calm, she began to speak. "Your Honor," she said, her voice measured, clear, unwavering, "I understand your role here. I respect the process, the court, and the authority you hold. But respect is not silence. Authority is not domination. And fear is never truth." The words cut through the tension like a blade, precise and undeniable. The audience leaned in. Some murmured in agreement. Others stared, stunned by the audacity and composure of this young legislator facing one of television's most formidable figures. Judy's lips tightened, her eyes narrowing, the gavel still hovering mid-air. For a moment, The silence was deafening. Then Jasmine continued, layering each point like a masterful crescendo. She didn't attack with venom. She didn't shout or belittle. Instead, she dismantled the very foundation of Judy's attempted intimidation. For decades, she said, people have been told to sit down, to hold their tongues, to shrink themselves to fit the mold of what is deemed acceptable. And every time someone obeys, the world loses a voice that matters. I will not be one of those voices lost. The words landed like thunder. The audience erupted quietly, cheers and gasps interweaving into a symphony of validation. Social media was already imagining the moment. Clips, memes, and hashtags forming before anyone could even blink. Hashtag Crockett Strong began trending in viewers' minds. The idea of dignity over domination spreading with every syllable Jasmine spoke. Judge Judy, for the first time that day, faltered. Her interruptions, her smirks, her gavel, none of it held the same power anymore. Jasmine had transformed the dynamics in an instant. She was no longer a defendant to silence. She was the storyteller, the controller of the narrative. Every word she spoke built a crescendo of moral authority, contrasting sharply with Judy's reactive frustration. Authority is only meaningful when it respects the humanity of those it governs, Jasmine said, her eyes scanning the courtroom, meeting the gaze of each spectator as though she were speaking directly to them. And fear can only dominate until courage decides to stand. Her voice carried both steel and warmth, a paradox that left listeners simultaneously challenged and inspired. The room leaned in further, every camera capturing subtle reactions. Judy's jaw tightening, her composure cracking just enough to reveal the human frustration behind her polished persona. Witnesses and spectators felt the shift, sensing that the scales of power had tilted, if only slightly, toward reason, justice, and truth. Jasmine paused briefly, letting the weight of her message settle, then delivered the line that would echo far beyond the courtroom. You may have the gavel, your honor, but I have the voice, and voices are louder than gavel strikes when they carry truth. A ripple passed through the courtroom. Whispers became audible, heads nodded, and subtle applause threatened to erupt. Even the most cynical onlookers could not deny the impact. She had taken a verbal assault designed to intimidate and flipped it into a display of calm, commanding authority. The social media imagination flared in real time. Viewers visualized GIFs of the stare down, clips of the unshakable calm, and threads discussing the moment as a defining political statement. Influencers, commentators, and ordinary citizens were all drawn into the narrative of dignity prevailing over arrogance. Every reaction compounded the effect, amplifying Jasmine's mic drop moment into a ripple that extended far beyond the room. Judge Judy's gavel finally fell, not as a tool of dominance, but as a punctuation mark to the inevitable. Jasmine had shifted the courtroom energy entirely. Each strike seemed almost ceremonial, acknowledging the undeniable truth Jasmine had delivered. Her words had pierced through decades of perceived invincibility, exposing the vulnerability behind the facade of control. Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't deliver finality with arrogance. Instead, she maintained the poise that had defined her rise, leaving the courtroom and the audience with a sense of awe. It was a lesson in power. True power resides in composure, clarity, and the courage to speak truth, even when silenced. As she concluded, the murmurs transformed into an anticipatory hush. Everyone sensed that the battle wasn't just about a single interruption anymore. It had become a defining statement about who controls narratives, who commands attention, and whose voices truly matter. The courtroom wasn't just a room. It was a stage for a larger cultural reckoning, a microcosm of the struggle between authority built on intimidation and courage rooted in principle. And as Jasmine quietly collected her notes, standing firm yet composed, the room seemed suspended in that tension, waiting for the inevitable reactions, the headlines, the ripple effects. Because what had happened in that courtroom was no longer a simple verbal clash. It was the beginning of a story that would resonate far beyond the walls, a story that demanded the world take notice. The moment Jasmine Crockett delivered her words, the courtroom felt as if it had shifted on its axis. Every spectator, every camera operator, every journalist in the room sensed that what had just occurred was far more than a courtroom confrontation. It was a statement that would reverberate across the country. Phones were raised, record buttons pressed, and whispers turned into a hum of anticipation, as if the room collectively understood that history had just been made. Within minutes, the clips of Jasmine's calm, devastating response began to circulate online. Social media exploded with activity, hashtags appearing like wildfire. Hashtag Crockett wins, hashtag voices over gavels, hashtag justice spoken. The courtroom had transformed into a stage, and the audience was now global. Ordinary citizens, activists, and political commentators alike shared snippets, replaying the split-second shifts in Judy's expression, the brief crack in her composure, as proof that authority could be challenged with dignity and intellect. Television networks picked up the story almost immediately. Analysts dissected the exchange frame by frame. One pundit remarked, "This is more than a courtroom moment. It's symbolic of an entire generational shift. Young leaders, particularly women of color, are asserting themselves in spaces that historically tried to silence them." Another commentator tweeted, "Judge Judy underestimated her." Jasmine Crockett didn't just reply. She rewrote the rules of engagement. The narrative began to take on a life of its own, spreading far beyond the courtroom doors, reaching millions who had never even watched the proceedings live. Politicians, community leaders, and celebrities weighed in, offering praise and validation. Public figures used the moment to reflect on broader themes: the fight for equality, the importance of representation, and the courage it takes to confront authority when history teaches submission. Comments poured in. People were sharing personal stories of moments when their voices had been dismissed, drawing inspiration from Jasmine's unwavering stance. Every clip, every meme, every retweet reinforced the idea that dignity and truth could overpower intimidation. Meanwhile, inside the courtroom, the atmosphere remained charged. Judge Judy, though composed on the surface, was visibly recalibrating. Her previous confidence had been disrupted, replaced by a reluctant recognition that Jasmine's words had landed with impact. The gavel, once a symbol of absolute control, now seemed almost ceremonial, a reminder that even the most powerful authority can be questioned when met with precision, courage, and composure. The ripple effects continued. News outlets ran segments titled, "The Day Jasmine Crockett Stunned the Courtroom," and "When Authority Met Its Match." Opinion pieces explored the deeper cultural implications, connecting the incident to wider conversations about representation, identity, and the evolving power dynamics in public spaces. Each analysis further amplified the resonance of Jasmine's response, framing it as a turning point for how authority could be challenged respectfully yet decisively. Audiences across the country engaged in debates, discussions, and online forums. Viewers dissected the tone, the phrasing, and the strategy Jasmine had used. People celebrated her ability to maintain composure while dismantling a long-established figure of authority. They shared clips with captions like, "This is how you respond to intimidation," and "Courage doesn't shout, it speaks truth." The moment became a learning example for activists, politicians, and ordinary citizens alike, demonstrating the power of calm, deliberate, and principled resistance. By the evening, the courtroom showdown had evolved into a broader cultural narrative. Jasmine Crockett was no longer just a participant in a televised legal exchange. She had become a symbol. Her words had sparked conversations about justice, courage, and the audacity to stand firm against a system that often tried to silence those who dared to speak. The echo of her voice, amplified through countless screens and social media feeds, had created a lasting impression, a reminder that courage and integrity could shape public perception, influence discourse, and inspire change. As the sun set on that day, the narrative was clear. The clash had been won not by force, volume, or intimidation, but by steadfastness, intelligence, and moral authority. And yet, the story was far from over. What had just occurred was merely the prelude to a larger movement, a movement that would continue to challenge assumptions, demand respect, and redefine who gets to be heard. In the quiet that followed the courtroom storm, the impact of Jasmine Crockett's words settled like a weight upon everyone present. It was no longer simply about Judge Judy or the gavel she wielded. It was about the principle that had been illuminated for all to see. Dignity cannot be silenced, and truth cannot be bowed to intimidation. For the audience, the lesson was immediate, visceral, and deeply inspiring. Jasmine's calm composure and unwavering stance had reframed the conflict entirely. What had begun as a tense struggle for control transformed into a demonstration of what courage looks like in practice. She had not shouted louder than her opponent. She had not demanded attention with theatrics. Instead, she had commanded it with clarity, precision, and integrity. Every observer, from the reporters to the social media followers, understood that the battle had been won through steadfastness rather than volume, through respect rather than rage, and through intellect rather than bluster. The narrator's voice carried the moral weight of the moment. In a world where voices are often drowned out by power, Jasmine Crockett reminded us that standing firm in your truth is itself an act of revolution. Authority may impose silence, but courage insists on being heard. It was a lesson that resonated far beyond the walls of the courtroom, echoing into homes, offices, and communities across the nation. Audiences reflected on their own experiences, drawing inspiration from her example. Those who had been dismissed at work, ignored in classrooms, or silenced in political arenas suddenly saw a blueprint for how to assert themselves with dignity. Jasmine's reply became more than words. It became a guiding principle. People began to recognize that the fight for respect and equality does not require anger to dominate. It requires clarity, conviction, and the courage to speak without compromise. This moment also underscored a timeless truth about leadership. True influence is not derived from the ability to intimidate or control, but from the capacity to inspire, persuade, and embody the values one seeks to promote. Jasmine's performance illustrated that real authority rests in aligning words with integrity and in using voice as a tool to uplift and challenge, not to oppress. Even Judge Judy, for all her legendary dominance, could not deny the moral authority Jasmine projected. In trying to silence her, she inadvertently highlighted the power inherent in principled resistance. The courtroom, initially a symbol of hierarchy and control, had become a stage for teaching empathy, justice, and courage. It was a reminder that systems built on fear and intimidation may seem powerful in the moment, but they are fragile when confronted by dignity, preparation, and unwavering resolve. The ripple effect of that day was already taking shape. Clips were shared widely, articles analyzed the confrontation, and conversations sparked in living rooms and online forums alike. It was a collective recognition that moments like these shape public consciousness. They teach society that standing up for oneself, even against a figure who seems untouchable, is both necessary and transformative. And yet, the story left viewers with a sense of anticipation. Jasmine's reply was decisive, but it was also an invitation to reflect, to act, and to continue challenging spaces where silence is demanded. The narrative closed not with finality, but with possibility, empowering the audience to envision a world where truth and courage outweigh fear and suppression. As the screen fades from the courtroom, the lesson lingers. Integrity outshines intimidation, dignity conquers arrogance, and one steadfast voice can awaken the courage of many. Jasmine Crockett had done more than defend herself. She had defended the principle that everyone deserves to be heard. The courtroom showdown between Jasmine Crockett and Judge Judy had ended, but the story was far from over. What began as a tense interruption had become a defining moment, a lesson in courage, dignity, and the power of voice. Jasmine had turned an attempt to silence her into a historic display of principle, leaving the world watching and listening in awe. For viewers, the message was clear. Standing up for yourself is never just about the moment at hand. It's about challenging systems that try to suppress voices, questioning authority that mistakes fear for respect, and insisting that truth is louder than intimidation. Jasmine's example showed that power does not belong to those who shout the loudest. It belongs to those who speak with clarity, conviction, and integrity. And now it's your turn. Every time you face doubt, dismissal, or attempt to silence your voice, remember what happened in that courtroom. Remember that courage is cultivated over time, that resilience is forged through struggle, and that standing firm can change the narrative not just for yourself, but for everyone watching. If this story inspired you, if it reminded you that your voice matters, share it. Talk about it. Bring it into the spaces where silence has been demanded. Join the conversation. Because moments like these aren't just entertainment. They're catalysts for reflection, action, and change. Subscribe to follow more stories that empower, challenge, and celebrate those who refuse to be silenced. Comment your thoughts, share your own experiences, and be part of a movement that proves dignity over arrogance, truth over fear, and courage over suppression always wins. The gavel has fallen, but the ripple of Jasmine Crockett's voice will continue. And now, you have a role in keeping it alive.